Welcome to the Dare to Know podcast. I'm your host, Fabian Corver. Today, we are joined by Lawrence Pasternack. Lawrence Pasternack is Professor of Philosophy and Director of Religious Studies at Oklahoma State University. His research focuses on Immanuel Kant, ethical theory, and philosophy of religion. Today, we will talk in particular about Professor Pasternack's book, Kant's Religion Within the Boundaries of Mere Reason, in Interpretation and Defense. Professor Pasternack, welcome to the Dare to Know podcast.
Thank you.
Yes. So maybe to start off, could you maybe tell us a little bit about your background? When did you become interested in the work of Immanuel Kant, and how has he kind of influenced your personal philosophical journey?
Well, I'm originally from Canada, more specifically a suburb of Toronto. I did my undergraduate at York University, which is in Toronto. I actually grew up very close to its campus, so I opted to go to York as an undergraduate. I think it was in my second year as an undergraduate, I decided to become a philosophy major. It just immediately clicked with me. It was sort of clear that that was what I was suited to, sort of really for life. And I developed at the time a strong interest in the philosophy of religion. When I was ready to graduate, I had a number of professors who did their master's degrees through a interdisciplinary program at Yale University, and they recommended that I explore that, and I did. And one of my thoughts was that wanting to work in the philosophy of religion, I didn't have much personal background with regards to organized religion, with regards to theology, and so I thought, you know, if I wanted to become a professional philosopher working in the philosophy of religion, it would make sense to spend some time learning theology. I did this joint, basically, philosophy and religion interdisciplinary master's degree. And while I was at Yale doing that, I started to get more interested in German philosophy. And the philosophy department at Yale was not strong at the time. I wanted to stay in New England, and I ended up opting to go to Boston University, who then hired Henry Allison as a Kant specialist. And while I was at BU, I was sort of roaming around, I think, trying to kind of exactly find what I wanted to do, some kind of integration of German philosophy and philosophy of religion. And when I got to my dissertation, I was also just practically thinking about what's going to get me a job. Okay. So rather than say writing a dissertation on Hegel or Kierkegaard, or writing a dissertation on Kant struck me as a good practical choice. My interest in Kant was certainly there, but you know, there was sort of this breadth of interest that Kant was sort of in the midst of. But I chose to write a dissertation on Kant. The dissertation was called Justification and Belief in Kant's Moral Philosophy. So it deals with some points of overlap between Kant's ethical theory and epistemology and philosophy of religion. So the issues of the nature of belief and so forth were built into that. And so my interest in Kant's philosophy of religion was sort of evolving. Even by the time I got my PhD, it still kind of hadn't yet sort of coalesced to that point. And so my first, say, 7 or 8 years of publishing sort of migrated around philosophy of religion and ethical theory. And then I took a sabbatical after I got tenured, and started to focus on the nature of belief in Kant. That plus reading Chris Firestone and Nathan Jacobs' book, In Defense of Kant's Religion, are kind of the two things that sort of where all my various philosophical interests came together and really gave me that greater focus that really, you know, honestly, until around 2008, I think that I just was, you know, exploring lots of things rather than sort of defining myself in a more specific way.
Very interesting. So today I would like to focus on your book, which is called Kant on Religion Within the Boundaries of Mere Reason, an Interpretation and Defense. So maybe to start off for the audience, could you maybe provide some historical context of when Kant published Religion Within the Boundaries of Mere Reason? And furthermore, how should we kind of understand the role of religion in Kant's critical philosophy more broadly?
Yeah, the publication of Kant's Religion, I'll just abbreviate the title by referring to it as Kant's Religion or the Religion, has a really interesting and complicated publication history. From what we gather from Kant's correspondences, he had originally planned to write a series of essays, 4 essays, on topics related to religion, basically at that time. And it began that way. So in 1792 was published an essay on radical evil that eventually became part 1 of the religion book. At that time also, Frederick William II had instituted some pretty stringent measures with regards to the approval process, the state-run approval process for publication. And so Kant had to, because this was a work on religion, he had to get state approval to publish it. So they approved that essay from the Radical Evil essay. And so then when Kant went on to write the next essay, it got rejected. They refused to give it their official approval for publication. So what Kant decided to do was he decided to finish off the additional essays that he was planning. So 4 essays, which became 4 parts of the religion, put them together into a single volume. And because the rules for approval were different between essays and a book, Kant chose a strategy whereby he was able to get the book declared to not be a work of religion, but instead philosophy. And so went through the path of getting it published that way. And that's probably a major reason why Kant got officially censored by the court, by the Prussian court, and prohibited from publishing on religion from 1794 until at least Frederick William II's death. Kant sort of saw himself as sort of relieved of that obligation to not publish on that topic after the death of Frederick William II. So the publication of the text is sort of peculiar because it was originally not planned to be a standalone volume. It was planned as a series of essays, and so Kant, for the reasons I described, put it together into a single book. And so that was published in 1793, and then a second edition was published in 1794. And there are just relatively minor differences between those two. Perhaps the most significant difference between the two is really just the second preface. So there's a lot of discussion, and it's very illuminating, that second preface, and at the same time there's certain passages that are controversial. So the second edition helped, I think, scholars, at least certainly now, gain a better understanding of what Kant's overall project was in the religion, which is more clearly articulated, I think, in the second edition. So the second part of your question was the place of Kant's philosophy of religion more broadly within.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, Kant's pre-critical writings provide treatments of proofs for God's existence. Certainly, philosophy of religion was something of interest to Kant. And so, as we know from the B preface to the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant articulates that among his sort of aims in the Critique of Pure Reason, in the development of transcendental idealism, is to identify the limits of knowledge in order to, quote unquote, make room for faith. So Kant seems to sort of build in an interest in religion right at the heart of transcendental idealism. It's not then sort of just this little addendum, and it's not something that only kind of manifests in Kant's later thought, but it seems to be integrated within his own critical turn, his own sort of new philosophical position that is articulated in the Critique of Pure Reason onwards. So, broadly speaking, it was then something that was of great importance to Kant. And then with regards to its place, one way you can sort of think about it is that there's sort of two elements to it, a negative and a positive element. So I think that until recent years, philosophers were most familiar with the negative aspect of it. So we have, for instance, Kant's infamous attacks on the traditional proofs for God's existence in the first critique. And so those were broadly anthologized, particularly, the famous existence is not a predicate claim with regards to the ontological argument. And so I think a lot of people saw Kant as an anti-religious thinker. And that, I think, was sort of the common perspective in Anglophone scholarship, in particular through the 20th century, where Kant was thought of as hostile to religion. But I think instead, one way to understand it is just like I mentioned with regards to that B preface, that passage from the B preface, that he sought the limits to knowledge in order to make room for faith. That part of what Kant was trying to do was trying to say that issues of religion don't fall within the scope of knowledge, right? So rejecting religion as he did with traditional metaphysics, trying to oppose basically claims, or opposing claims say that we have some grasp on the nature of things in themselves. So there's all these negative critiques, right? There's the attack on the traditional arguments for God's existence, and a rejection of the knowability of God, and so on. But that's certainly not the end of the story. So one could understand how a religious person would say, look, my religious commitments aren't matters of theoretical knowledge, they're matters of faith. And so this is, I think, the way we need to understand Kant, that he wants to establish that religion is not something that falls within the spectrum of knowledge, but instead it's a matter of faith. Now then, of course, the issue is, what does faith mean for Kant? And faith has a deeply practical character for Kant. So the place of Kant's religion, it's not within the spectrum of theoretical philosophy. Within the spectrum of theoretical philosophy, we just have these critiques basically saying that we can't have knowledge of God or proofs for God's existence and so on. However, it is integral to, or at least flows out of, perhaps might be another way of putting it, his practical philosophy.
Very interesting. We will unpack this more during the call, but maybe focusing on faith in particular. So in the book, you describe also that, at least from one interpretation, Kant believes there is a universal need for faith, and that it is, however, not characterized as objective. Instead, it is subjectively necessary. So can you maybe unpack what this means? In what sense is it not objectively necessary, but subjectively necessary? And how should we understand kind of this need for faith, very broadly speaking? And maybe you can also unpack what is it really, what faith is for Kant?
Yeah, so I think that if you looked at different texts, you'd find some that are more suggestive of faith as being, as you put it, subjectively necessary as opposed to objective. Well, there are still passages that present it as objective. And part of the question is exactly what does that mean? Subjective versus objective in this context. Excuse me. And there is a important footnote in the second edition. In the second critique of 5.143, the footnote there, where Kant is actually characterizing religious assent within the context of it being objective rather than subjective. So I think if you look at the second critique, you're going to get a picture of religious assent that might make it look somewhat more objective than if you see it with regards to, say, the treatment of the nature of faith in the third critique. All right, so what is faith for Kant? In the canon of the first critique, Kant discusses knowledge, opinion, and faith. And he says that he uses this terminology, subjective and objective sufficiency. And so knowledge is both subjectively and objectively sufficient. And the way to understand that is the objective sufficiency of knowledge is that there's epistemic grounds that are sufficient to say that this is true. So, we think about it in terms of justified true belief. The objective sufficiency has to do with the justification aspect of knowledge. Then subjective sufficiency could be construed in terms of our assenting to it. So when we say it's subjectively sufficient, what we mean is that I have a commitment to it that is, in a certain sense, maximal. It's not sort of a wavering, hesitancy with regards to assent. It's a full, robust commitment. And the way I read this as well is that it's not just a psychological notion. Subjective sufficiency is not just a psychological notion. There's a normative aspect to it, in that the commitment that I have, that full-fledged commitment that I have in the assenting, is one that has some sort of appropriate ground. Mm-hmm. Now, that's the way knowledge is characterized. Opinion is characterized by Kant as neither objectively nor subjectively sufficient. That is, the warrants, the justification for the assent falls below that of certainty. So it's not sufficient in that context. And then also the level of commitment that I have is not maximal. It's not a matter of that total affirmation. And so when we opine, we say, oh, well, it's possibly the case, or it's more likely than not, or something like that. And so opinion is characterized as neither objectively nor subjectively sufficient. Then when it comes to faith, Kant characterizes faith there as subjectively but not objectively sufficient. Mm-hmm. So it's not objectively sufficient in the sense that it doesn't have the kind of epistemic grounds that we associate with knowledge. Mm-hmm. It's not the sort of thing for which there is empirical evidence or for which there's theoretical demonstration. So it lacks objective sufficiency in that epistemic sense. It's subjectively sufficient, however, in that Kant characterizes the assent of faith as a matter of certainty. It's right, so the maximum level of commitment. But as well as that, like I said, that subjective sufficiency has a normative character to it, in that the commitment has a basis that whether or not one calls it objective, or whether or not one construes it as some kind of subjective universality, mm-hmm. one way or another, the commitment is one that is not based upon mere private validity, as Kant puts it with regards to what he calls persuasion, right? Sort of delusional or biased thinking, wishful thinking commitments, and so on. So faith for Kant is something that lacks that objective sufficiency in the sense of epistemic warrants, but has subjective sufficiency in the sense of a full commitment, and that subjective sufficiency has a grounding to it that makes it other than just private or subjective, or in that negative sense, or arbitrary. Mm-hmm. So what's the nature of the ground then becomes the issue, right? So do we want to characterize that ground as one that is in some other sense objective, or do we want to characterize it as somehow subjectively necessary? And I think that that's something that potentially you could interpret in either direction. And so if you look, for instance, at the Critique of Judgment, the basic argument there for religious assent is that an individual who doesn't subscribe to a religious worldview is somebody who's going to be more susceptible to moral despair. So you see all the suffering in the world and you think, oh, regardless of all the efforts that people put into making the world a better place, it doesn't ever really turn out that way. And there's a sense of futility in one's work, leading to a loss of motivation, mm-hmm. right? Or moral despair. So a way then to understand religious assent within that context is then to say this, that I ought to be as morally good of a person as I can be. I know, given what human nature is like, given my own character and so on, that when I confront various hindrances to moral resolve, is the phrase that Kant uses, when I confront various hindrances to moral resolve, I could simply just throw up my hands and say, it's all too hard, it's futile, it's hopeless, and let's just give it all up, right? Just look out for my own self. Well, because we ought to become as morally good, as a person, right, as possible, we should presumably, therefore, find a way to overcome these hindrances to moral resolve. Mm-hmm. And so Kant proposes that the adoption of a religious worldview is one that would allow us to overcome such hindrances. We can talk about the details there, but I think one reasonable way of understanding religious assent within Kant is to think about it within that framework, that there is a moral argument, right, that the morally upright individual is somebody who is aware of their limitations and wants to find ways to address those limitations, and recognizes that if they were to have a religious worldview, then that might strengthen their resolve to fight against confrontations with the injustices of the world and the pain and suffering of life, as well as that one's own dispositions and one's own desire for one's own happiness that runs contrary to morality. So whether you construe that as objective or subjective, you can think about it within the context of anthropology, right? You can think about it in terms of, this is what human nature is like, and these are the hindrances to our being moral, and here is a way, and perhaps a necessary way, for us human beings to address those hindrances. So you can think about it in that somewhat more psychological way.
I see. And just one quick comment, like in that last sense, like that it's necessary. Does that relate to that? That's the only way of actually overcoming those hindrances, or like dealing with them, or is it not necessary in the sense of that's kind of the only way of dealing with those hindrances in kind of a psychological sense?
There are passages where Kant presents these hindrances as ones that are integral to human nature. In the first preface to the Religion, for instance, he really speaks very much in these terms. And so if it's integral to human nature, then we could say that we human beings are vulnerable specifically in these ways that need an overcoming, and the only overcoming that it seems that Kant regards as possible or viable or sufficient, satisfactory in light of these hindrances, is a religious worldview. And that could be understood in terms of the highest good. So, just briefly, Kant's conception of the highest good, and I know you have questions specific to that, but Kant's conception of the highest good is roughly a synthesis between morality and happiness. So it's this ideal state of affairs in which there is a proportionate distribution of happiness in accordance with moral worth. That's a standard language that Kant uses. And so one way to understand then faith is that when Kant talks about all these hindrances to our moral resolve, one of the key ones is our own desire for our own happiness. And so if that is something that's constantly interfering with my ability to be moral, if I were to say that by my pursuing morality, I will realize happiness, then I have a way of basically incorporating that desire for happiness within my moral commitments. So that I'd say, in order for me to not lose or diminish my ability to manage my pursuit of morality, in order for me to not let happiness overtake my interests, I can basically say that for moral purposes, for the sake of my maintaining myself as a moral agent, I need to find a way to find a way to involve this desire for happiness such that it doesn't undermine me as a moral agent, doesn't take away from my moral agency.
That's very interesting. One thought that comes to mind, and I'm not sure if I'm making it more complex than it has, inner worldly hope and outer worldly hope. I don't know how that would relate, for example, with overcoming these hindrances. For example, like inner worldly hope would be, okay, the hope for progress. Like if that would be enough to overcome these hindrances, like how does that fit in this story that you're talking about with overcoming these hindrances through faith, for example? Like how does this kind of comment fit in?
Well, in the literature on Kant's conception of the highest good, there's something of a dispute with regards to whether or not Kant ever allowed for what would be construed as a secular version of the highest good. And so part of what's going on there is that if I say, for the sake of my own moral agency, I need to find a way to overcome how happiness interferes with me as an agent. And if I then say, by being moral, somehow I will get the happiness that I deserve. How does that happen, right? How does it happen that if I pursue morality, that somehow that'll get me to happiness? And what we see throughout Kant's writings is, well, if there's a God and if there's an afterlife, right, then God, right, in the future life, the afterlife, existence that presumably we have in some way after we bodily die, God could distribute happiness in proportion to moral worth. All right, so that's sort of the crux of the theological version. But then some people want to propose that there's a secular alternative, that it might be this sort of, multi-generational effort, that sort of generation after generation after generation, we try to perfect the world such that ultimately there will be this distribution of happiness in accordance with moral worth, or that we try within our lives here to improve the institutions of justice and so on, and thus it's sort of like a regulative principle, maybe nothing that we could ever really realize, but nevertheless what we're supposed to do is find a way within this world that there can be such a distribution of happiness in accordance with moral worth. And so some people think that is a view that Kant at least entertains. Some people think that it's a view that Kant migrates to. I think that's not correct. I think that Kant, we could talk about the details, but I think that Kant never advanced a secular conception. Mm-hmm. And the passages that people use to try to claim that he did, they're just misreading.
I see. Very interesting. So, you already referred to indeed Kant's doctrine of the highest good. So in your book, you explained that there are kind of two layers or aspects to this doctrine, namely the highest good as duty and the highest good as ideal. So can you maybe, you already introduced a little bit the doctrine, but now specifically kind of these two layers that we're talking about.
So the highest good is an ideal, basically, to be thought of as an ideal state of affairs, right? A state of affairs in which there is an exact distribution of happiness in accordance with moral worth. Like I said, that's sort of the standard formula that Kant uses. So that's sort of the understanding of the highest good as an ideal. And so there's also a duty we have to promote the highest good. And this just causes so much cognitive dissonance, because if what was supposed to be realized is this exact distribution of happiness in accordance with moral worth, how could we have a duty to do that, right? Because part of that would presume that we're in a position to judge one another's moral worth, which Kant repeatedly says we're not. We aren't able to assess even on our own personal moral worth. So how could, it violates what implies Kant. If we had a duty to distribute happiness in accordance with moral worth, but we're not in a position to assess moral worth, right? Then it's not something we could even do. It's not something we could even get off the ground. It's not something that we could try to somehow direct ourselves to in a more regulatory way, because the fundamental demand there is not even something we have a chance of doing, judging moral worth.
To quickly jump in, can you maybe just clarify for the audience, what the ought implies can kind of mean?
Sure. So a standard commitment that we see with Kant is this notion of ought implies can. If something ought to be the case, if you have a duty, if you ought to do this, then it must, in some sense, be possible. Now, in what sense of possibility, people can debate that. But if it were my duty to do something, then it must be possible. I must have somehow within myself or within the world a means to bring it about. Because if it's not possible, then Kant would maintain that it couldn't be a duty for us. So if it's not possible for me to judge one another's moral worth, then how could it be a duty for me to distribute happiness in proportion to moral worth? There's something that's really off about that. But I don't think that's ever Kant's view. That's something that people have discussed. There are people who think that in that secular interpretation of highest good, they think that that's Kant's view. There are a few passages where they read it that way, but I often say, just, look at the broader context, or look at the footnote here, or let's try to define these terms. And once you understand the language that Kant is using, or read the relevant footnotes and so on, I think that secular account just goes away.
I see.
So the ought implies can. How do you satisfy it? Well, if there, in the abstract sense, there ought to be this distribution of happiness in accordance with moral worth, and it's not something that we could do because we don't have that power. This calls upon us to postulate the conditions for its possibility, which is God in the afterlife. Yet we still have a duty. So the question is, what is our duty if it is God and not us who judges? And if it's only within God's abilities to make those judgments, God presumably then in the afterlife is the one who distributes that happiness, then what role do we have in any of this? So where's the place for a duty if God is the one who judges and distributes? Well, the answer that I give to that is, and there's passages which support this, is that Kant describes basically the realization of the highest good in terms of the division of labor between humanity and God. There's one part of it that we're responsible for, and there's another part of it that God is responsible for. That's the language that Kant uses. So God's responsibility is the distribution of happiness in accordance with moral worth. Our responsibility is that moral worth, to become worthy of happiness. So what therefore is our duty to the highest good? The way I take it is that it is a duty to become worthy of happiness. And more specifically, because, you could say individually, yes, we have a duty to do all the things that morality commands of us. So basically, we have a duty to maximize, our moral goodness and thus become worthy of happiness. In the religion, Kant also characterizes this duty as a corporate one, a sui generis duty of the species to itself. So one way to think about the duty to the highest good is that we have a collective duty as a species. And there's philosophical reasons for Kant wanting to put it within that collective context. So we have a corporate or a collective responsibility as human beings to one another to work on one another's moral worthiness. So that's the way I construe the duty that we have towards the highest good. It has to do with a corporate duty that humanity has to itself to become worthy of happiness.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. And I think also in the book you discuss kind of that he does develop and change his views on this highest good doctrine, basically. Can you maybe, run us through kind of these developments?
Sure. In the Critique of Pure Reason, in the canon of the Critique of Pure Reason, the last little sections of it, Kant discusses the highest good. And he discusses it within this account of agency that doesn't look like what we see in the groundwork, in Kant's groundwork and thereafter. So a number of Kant scholars, Henry Allison and others, have proposed that right around in late 1770s, through the early 1780s, Kant hadn't yet quite put together his full picture of moral agency that we see in the groundwork and onwards. And so Kant, like we see in his pre-critical writings, Kant still sort of thinks about morality as sort of this divided or conflicted aspect of philosophy, where on the one hand, the principles of morality are supposed to be universal and necessary, so fall out of reason in some way. On the other hand, human nature is such that we're basically, he subscribes to what you might think of as a sentimentalist or Humean belief desire account, so that we're motivated by our desires, presumably our own happiness. And so on the one hand, there are these abstract moral principles, and on the other hand, what drives us is desire. So it's not that conception of pure practical reason we see in the groundwork and onwards. Instead, in the canon of the First Critique, what it looks like Kant is saying is that, well, morality commands us, but we need to find something to make us want to make us desire to be moral, because it's not a matter of somehow an inherent desire, it's not flowing out of reason and so on. We just have a natural desire for our own happiness. So what we need to do is we need to somehow find a way to leverage that desire for happiness to get us to want to be moral. Well, that's where the idea there of rewards and punishments in the afterlife come in, right? So if I want to be happy and God will make me happy in the afterlife, I'll be rewarded with happiness in the afterlife if I'm moral. Now I have a self-interested motive. So when you look at the canon of the First Critique, it's often interpreted in that way. It's still kind of a sort of a not yet, the critical mature Kant with regards to agency. And so the idea of the highest good as presented there seems then to fill in this gap, right? This motivational gap to get the Humean agent to do the rationalist morality. So you'd kind of then say, okay, well, the highest good has no significant role in the groundwork. So why didn't Kant just abandon the doctrine of the highest good? Once he comes up with the idea of having a will that can determine itself through reason, what do you need that motivational complexity, gap filler, so to speak, of the highest good? What's the point of it anymore? Well, we see, for instance, in a minor essay Kant wrote, I think it was 1786, if I recall, what does it mean to orient oneself in thinking? It's an essay that Kant wrote in response to the pantheism controversy, the controversy that had to do with whether or not Lessing somehow secretly was a Spinozist. Kant there takes on some language that you also saw in the first critique about the needs of reason. And Kant reintroduces the highest good in that essay with a new kind of foundation. And we see that then carry over into the second critique. So the first critique gives us an account of the role of the highest good, predicated upon a notion of agency that Kant presumably then abandons. But Kant doesn't want to give up the highest good. Maybe he has extra philosophical reasons, or maybe just, because he sees a new and more accurate place for it. But that new and more accurate place has to do with, well, at least in the second critique, Kant characterizes the highest good as this total object of pure practical reason. So just like in the first critique, theoretical reason seeks the unconditioned condition. So in the second critique, in its dialectic, we see how practical reason seeks its unconditioned condition. And so sort of the two things that the will presumably has as ends, morality and happiness. And so the total object, right, is going to be the synthesis of those two ends. And thus there's a kind of architectonic characterization of the highest good with regards to this notion of agency and notion of the ends of reason that Kant then develops, and so basically creates a new story behind the highest good in the second critique.
Very interesting. And wondering, like, how does the motivational story kind of play out when you don't get kind of that kind of motivational force from kind of the religion writings of Kant?
When you just think about Kant's conception of morality, right, that there's sort of two potential ways of interpreting that conception of agency and morality. One is sometimes referred to as the affectivist, and the other is referred to as the intellectualist readings of motivation.
Yeah. And
so the intellectualist version, which is, I guess, what I'm more sympathetic with, is that I attend to intellectually, I attend to what ought to be the case. I think about my subjective principles of volition, my maxims, and I'm aware of the kind of the normative force of reason, and I ask myself whether or not these subjective principles of volition can meet these rational standards, principle of universalizability, and so on. And so I'd say, oh, hey, well, that maxim that I've been acting on actually cannot be made into a universal law. I ought to stop doing it. So I think that one could simply understand that piece of Kantian agency in terms of just the intellectual understanding of this rule, and I realize this is what I ought to do, and so choose accordingly. The affectivist version seems to take it that there has to be some affect or feeling or emotional piece still to the story here. And so when you look at the second critique and its discussions of humility and respect, for instance, the alternative version is to say that I'm aware intellectually of the moral law, which then triggers within me these feelings, these moral feelings, right? One is humility. It's like, oh, gee, the moral law is so important. Who am I to have violated it? And it humbles me. And that, of course, the importance of the moral law, right? I have this respect towards it. So another way of understanding motivation within this context then is to say that it's my reaction, these feelings that I have of humility and respect that play a motivational role. And so the way I kind of see this is, we can grant that there are these feelings, but it doesn't seem clear to me that they're necessary. It seems like, why couldn't we say, if we're a rational agent, that I understand this is wrong, and it's because I understand that it's wrong that I don't do it, as opposed to adding in the feeling parts, right? The feeling parts may be there, but I don't see them as playing a necessary role with regards to our engaging in morality.
I see. Yeah, that's very helpful. So maybe shifting topics a little bit. So Kant has three fundamental questions: what can I know? what ought I to do, and what may I hope for, or what may I hope. And a lot of people kind of interpret this as the crucial part is kind of what may I hope for, and not necessarily what must I hope for, or what must I hope. So maybe can you clarify kind of the importance of the what may I hope for, and how we should understand that related to religion?
Quite a few years ago, I had planned on working on that, and just other things kind of took me in a different direction. But the idea of for what may I hope, the word may in there, trying to kind of cash out the significance, because there are lots of things that we hope for, right? Yeah. But then this is one that says, for what may I hope, right? So there's a sense of a norm there. And so on the one hand, we could say, look, it's possible that I could hope for anything, but there's some sense of what I ought to, or am expected to, or what do I have permission to hope for. But one way or another, there's sort of this connotation of, in may, of some kind of normative piece to it.
I see.
So a way to think about this is to say that, well, all hopes are directed towards happiness, Kant proposes, right? But then there's also then the highest good as this unique object of hope. And so what is the difference there? One way to think about it is to say that, well, it's sort of a natural psychological aspect of humanity that we have these hopes and we have these wishes, of course, too, that there may be certain kinds of hopes that are demanded of us even. So rather than just seeing what may I hope, what should I hope for?
Yeah.
And so I don't know how much real philosophical work that question does in driving Kant's discussions of the highest good. I often think that for what may I hope gets kind of overtaken by other arguments. But nevertheless, within that word may, there is something that is prescriptive or normative there. Yeah. And so you might then want to then say that the highest good has this sort of unique status as an object of hope that is coming out of some account of a rational requirement for us. But then how you cash out that rational requirement, we can go back to the issues of whether or not it's objective, whether or not it's subjectively necessary, to what extent it has to do with human psychology, to what extent it's architectonic, and so on.
I see. And so I get indeed, that's very interesting, this normative dimension in the may, but also the normative dimension in the must hope for. That's a stronger kind of, more stringent requirement, I guess. But why doesn't he go that far? Because some religions might say, no, you must hope for this. So, like, can you maybe sketch some contrast between indeed other kind of philosophies related to religion and how this might be kind of sending a different requirement on that?
Well, it is, I think, a question as to whether or not Kant would take it that we all ought to subscribe to the highest good and to the practical postulates. Kant denies, in the second critique, Kant denies that we would have a duty to believe. And so if we don't have a duty to hold to these beliefs, then it's hard to kind of get a good sense of the prescriptive aspect to any of this. But what we see, for instance, in one of the classic formulations, the absurdum practicum argument, that I would be reprehensible in my own eyes were I not to subscribe to the highest good. So the idea here is then that I'm vulnerable, and I'm vulnerable to these hindrances to moral resolve. And that if I don't take appropriate action, then I'm basically setting myself up for failure. And so there's a moral command, therefore, to take those measures so that you can be as morally good as you're capable of. And so I ought, therefore, to commit to the highest good. So Kant says that this is not a duty, right? But he does say that we have a moral interest in the commitments. And I have a theory as to why he doesn't want to treat it as a duty. I think there's a historical explanation for it. At least one one way of seeing it is to see it historically, that basically with the rise of what we might want to construe as the religious right in Prussia and the demands of the time to have these official religious doctrines to which people had to subscribe, Kant was so adverse to the idea of there being an obligation or a command, right, to believe, that he didn't want to allow for it. But then you might want to say, well, you don't want a command to believe based upon authority of the state. You don't want a command to believe based upon something other than reason. What if reason could command it? So while Kant denies there being a duty to belief, it's not clear to me that follows from Kant's philosophical view. If you understand that command to believe within sort of the right framework, within a picture of agency and what's required of us in order to be moral and so on. On the other hand, some people might want to read all this as saying there is no necessity to believe, right? There is no necessity to even, to hold out hope. It's like it's there if you need it, but you don't necessarily have to have it. So some people might want to think about all of this as it's like the fallback measure for people who get into this situation where they're sort of on the precipice of despair.
I see. As
opposed to it being something that is unavoidable. These commitments are ones that without which we're never going to be as moral as we ought. So I think that there's an open debate on that, and you can look at different texts to kind of see passages supporting one side versus the other.
Very, very interesting. So Kant also distinguishes between theological ethics and the moral theology. So can you maybe explain this distinction that Kant makes and kind of what's the relevance of making this distinction?
Well, Kant as he advances the positive role for religion, doesn't want to be misunderstood, misconstrued as somehow giving up on the conception of morality, right, that we associate with it. So Kant doesn't want people to think that morality has its basis in religion. And so we end up with this complicated situation where there's an account of moral motivation that calls upon us to be religious. But it's not as if the moral law, the authority of the moral law, depends upon religion. And so that's a way of understanding the distinction, that Kant rejects this theological ethics in the sense of having something like a divine command theory. Kant rejects the idea that morality's authority would have to find its basis in religion, even though Kant does say that we human beings, our motivational needs are such that there may be a necessary role, if not minimally, a very important role for religion with regards to our ability to sustain ourselves morally.
Very interesting. And then kind of following up on this, another distinction that he makes that might tie up with this is a kind of between biblical and philosophical theology. So now specifically focusing in theology, he also makes another distinction there. So again, what's the relevance there?
And one of the main sources for Kant's distinction between the biblical and philosophical theology is the preface to the first edition of the Religion. And so I have a paper from a few years ago that discusses Kant's religion, spends a lot of time with that first preface, and puts it within the context of the politics of the day. So if we go back to the troubles that Kant had with regards to publication, and what Kant needed in order to do to get the Religion published was have the work declared as a philosophical work as opposed to a work of religion. That you can read much of the first preface to the Religion as Kant's rationale for the measures that he took in order to get it published. So I'm going to now distinguish between biblical theology and philosophical theology to tell you that this is a work of philosophical theology and not biblical theology, because if it were a work of biblical theology, then I would have had to have gone through a different process to get it published than I did. So one way of reading that distinction is to read it within the context of Kant's own justification for the route that he took. So what is the biblical theologian? The biblical theologian is essentially somebody who is the scholar of the text, right? Somebody who does philological work, somebody who understands the interrelationship between various components of the Bible, people who do the history, right, from the eras in which it was written, and so on. So the biblical theologian is somebody who, in a certain sense, does a lot of empirical stuff, right? History, linguistics, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
The philosophical theologian is the one who explores, Kant uses the term pure rational system of religion, that thinks about the rational nature of religion. What reason can direct us to with regards to religion? Mm-hmm. What sort of evaluative mechanisms and how to assess doctrines in relationship to those evaluative mechanisms.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. One of Kant's kind of most infamous moral thesis that he states, and that's often mentioned as kind of a radical view, also different from other Enlightenment thinkers, is that he kind of states that the whole of the human species is by nature evil. So can you maybe kind of explain to us what does this mean for Kant? In what sense are we all by nature evil? And then also maybe introduce into the story the propensity to evil. This is a very important thing you talk about in the book. So maybe can you provide us kind of with some context and how should we understand this and what's the relevance of all this related to religion? Quite a few questions.
Sure. Until basically, I don't know, 10 or 12 years ago, I think that overwhelmingly the scholarship on the religion treated the book as a kind of resource to sort of cull various notions from. So rather than trying to interpret the work as a whole, right, most Kantians, they go through it and they're not too interested in most of this theological stuff, but they want to sort of glean out of it, right, bits and pieces of, you know, Kant's broader conception of human agency and so on. And so this conception of radical evil, if you just sort of pull it out of the text, you could sort of see it as another piece of Kant's conception of agency. But I think that even though there's something to that, I think that hermeneutically, that's the wrong approach. Even though Kant initially planned to write the book in terms of 4 essays, still there was 4 thematically related essays. And and when you look at the 2 prefaces, and as I said earlier, I think the second preface is even more clear about the aims of the religion than the first preface, is Kant explains that basically the goal, and the title of the work, Religion Within the Bounds of Mere Reason, Kant explains that the goal is to take the doctrines of historical faith, you know, primarily Christianity, almost exclusively Christianity, but it could be applied to other religions. But take the doctrines, take core Christian doctrines, and then examine them with regards to whether or not they have, as he puts it, unity or compatibility with the pure rational system of religion. So a way to read the entire text is to say that Kant takes what he calls fragments of historical faith and holds them up, this is his language, to moral concepts. And so he's taking one doctrine after another doctrine after another doctrine after another doctrine, holding them up to, right, his philosophical system to see whether or not that doctrine or some version of interpretation of that doctrine falls within the inner sphere of rational religion, right? Religion within the bounds of mere reason. So he uses the metaphor of these 2 spheres, one larger, the other one smaller. That smaller sphere inside the larger sphere is the domain of doctrines that accord with rational religion. And then outside of that, there's further doctrines. So each part of the religion can be interpreted as basically Kant taking a Christian doctrine and asking whether or not that doctrine or some version of that doctrine falls within the inner sphere of rational religion. So what does he do? Part 1 is primarily then about the doctrine of original sin. Part 2 of the religion is about doctrines that have to do with salvation and redemption. Part 3 is the role of the church and a few other things. Then part 4 is religious practices. So part 1, he says, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to engage in the following exercise. I'm going to take one Christian doctrine after another, hold them up to moral concepts to see whether or not they have unity or compatibility with rational religion. And in Kant doing this, he's not doing anything new, in a sense, in that, for hundreds of years, philosophers have done that kind of work, right? They've taken religious doctrines and they have explored whether or not these religious doctrines can be understood within a philosophical framework. Mm-hmm. And as I see it, Kant is doing the same. So he is taking one doctrine after another, and he's assessing, or, Kant says he never appraises Christianity. He makes no appraisal, right, of Christianity. It's just hard to construe that Kant is not appraising Christianity. When he rejects vicarious atonement and so on in part 2, mm-hmm. he's coming out with philosophical positions, rejecting passive reception of grace and so forth. He's evaluating them, whether or not this is a apt religious doctrine for rational religion. So with regards to then original sin, what we have is, what does original sin say? All of humanity is fallen. We're all corrupt, or we're all evil. So when Kant explores this question of radical evil, explores the question all of humanity, we shouldn't think about it as sort of Kant simply just immediately coming out as, here's my view, everybody. Mm-hmm. Humanity is evil. Right. No, he's saying, here's my project. I'm going to take these doctrines and I'm going to evaluate them. The first doctrine we're going to look at is the thesis that humanity is evil.
Mm-hmm. Just to quickly jump in, I think one interesting thing that you say also is that indeed Kant see this as kind of experiments. We're doing experiments. I think you mentioned it also in the book.
Yeah, and to be honest, my view on that is somewhat changed.
Okay.
So I would love it to be able to write a second edition of the book, because my view on a few things have changed, and that's one of them. In both the first and the second preface, Kant uses the German term Versuch, which is often just translated as attempt. Mm. But just sort of as a legacy issue in English translations of this text, some translation, I forget which, give or take 100 years ago, translated Versuch as experiment, and that kind of stuck. But it's sort of anomalous to use the word experiment. And in the second edition, Kant uses the phrase Zweitenversuch, right? Second experiment. But he never mentions a first experiment. Mm. And so this has led to all this controversy as to what this unstated first experiment of the religion is, and how does it differ from the second experiment, and so on. And when I wrote the book, it didn't cross my mind, but maybe I think a year or maybe 2 years after it published, it just dawned on me one day that Kant talks about Versuch in the first preface, right? This attempt to compare historical doctrines to rational religion. And then in the second preface, he talks about, again, this attempt, but he calls it now his second attempt. Mm-hmm. And it just hit me, like, this is right at the opening of the preface to the second edition. So basically what Kant does is he explains the title. People are confused about the title of the book. He explains the title. And then he says, from this standpoint, we can now conduct our Zweitenversuch. So it just occurred to me that maybe what Kant, simply that all that he's saying there is, here's my second edition. Here's my second attempt.
Okay.
Right? The first edition was my Versuch, unnumerated, because he wasn't intending at that point to have a second edition. Now that he has a second edition, the same description basically that he uses with regards to the question of the text, the relationship between historical faith and rational religion, is going to be explored again now in this new edition. So now it's my second attempt. And that's all that he meant by it. Despite all the literature that is all the ink that's been spilled on trying to make sense of the first and second experiment and where the unstated first experiment is and so on, I think that all that Kant meant there was, this is my second attempt. This is the second edition. So nevertheless, the experiment, if we want to call it that, it's sort of okay to call it that still. The experiment of the text is to say, take the whole body of Christian doctrines, hold them up to moral concepts. Let's find out which of these doctrines have unity or compatibility with rational religion. And so in part 1, let's take that sort of starting off point We're all fallen, we're all sinners, we're all evil. Here's that doctrine. Let's hold it up to moral concepts, and let's see whether or not it's compatible with rational religion. So what part one then does is it takes basically the Augustinian conception of original sin, and then explores that conception to find out whether or not there's a way in which it can be construed as compatible with rational religion. And Kant rejects various aspects of it, like, for instance, that it's inherited from Adam. He rejects the idea that that state of being evil has to do with a corruption of our capacities. And so he says, therefore, is there a way in which we can understand this idea of radical evil, or the universal character of human evil, in such a way that is compatible with rational religion? So he explores the Augustinian version. He says, no, this part of it can't be taken this way. If it were the case that our faculties are just fundamentally corrupted, then what way do we have out of it? Right?
Yep.
Except through passive reception of grace, which he rejects. So it has to be also understood as chosen, because if it's morally evil, then we're responsible for it. It's a moral conception. It's a moral notion. So if we want to say that the human nature is evil, universally evil, then we're saying that if it's a function of humanity, then somehow it has to be innate, has to be part of human nature. But it can't be unchosen. If it were unchosen, it couldn't be construed in a moral context. It couldn't be thought of as morally evil. So it has to be both innate and chosen. So if you want to say that humanity is evil, you have to take on a conception of it to say that it is innate but chosen. And so now to the issue of the propensity to evil. So Kant talks about a propensity to evil. He talks about a bare propensity to evil. This propensity in some sense is innate and in some sense is chosen. And one way of understanding it is to say that it's human nature is such that we have a propensity. Something about us would tend to make us evil. And what Kant means by evil is the prioritization of self-interest over morality. So what is evil for Kant? It's not that we want to do evil for evil's sake. He says, no, that's not what human beings are like. That human beings instead are going to make one or another choice. We're either going to choose to prioritize morality over self-interest, or we're going to choose to prioritize self-interest over morality. This is, our supreme maxim, as he calls it sometimes. It's our fundamental moral disposition, kasina. So the thought is that all of humanity will choose to prioritize self-interest over morality. There's something about us, a disposition, such that we all end up making that choice. And we can undo that choice, but we all start out that way. And it is all of us that has to do with sort of the idea of innateness, but it's also chosen because it has to be moral. And so there's lots of disputes as to understand how could it be chosen. Kant uses language, it's there from our youth onwards. Some people want to say that it's chosen in some noumenal sense, or you can understand, or you can understand it developmentally as well. And I take on a developmental interpretation of that choice, not because I philosophically think that that's exactly the view that I would want to hold, but I just think that it does adequate work. And I think that it's compatible with the passages. When people sometimes say there's some notion of timeless agency here, that somehow it is a choice to prioritize self-interest over morality that's done outside of time. But if you read the language where the issues of temporality come up, they can be read in such a way that it's still within time. It's just always that whenever a person acts, we have to say that there already has been, prior to that, a commitment. And so I can't say, here's that moment, being right on the spot. I could point to when the choice is made. In some sense, it always has to be sort of rationally reconstructed back. As soon as we engage in any kind of agency, we have to attribute it to ourselves.
I see. That's very interesting. And also, I mean, one kind of question that comes to mind, you also mentioned at one point, and I'm not sure entirely if this is relevant, like kind of that it's unity or compatible with rational religion. But is there any difference between like that the unity is kind of stronger, that it actually makes the case in a much more powerful sense, or compatible just in the case of it works together, but it doesn't provide extra force?
You know, possibly so. Kant uses the phrase whether or not a doctrine of historical faith has unity or compatibility. So that's Kant's phrase from the second preface of the religion. But there is a difference, of course, between them.
Yeah.
And so you might say, I have this one paper where I suggest that if you were to break down all the doctrines of historical faith, some of them fall within that inner sphere, so have unity. Some of them I characterize as anathema to rational religion. Ones that Kant simply says, no way, there is no way that this doctrine is going to be compatible with rational religion. So examples are vicarious atonement, passive reception of grace, because both of those are, it's not our doing, but somebody else is doing what happens to us morally. Right? So I take it that there are some doctrines that Kant says outright incompatible.
Yeah.
But there are other doctrines that you might sort of think of as sort of peripheral. It's sort of like sitting on the boundary. Ones that you could possibly read as compatible, but it doesn't seem to be sort of like the essential part of the story. Yeah. Like you might want to say that some account of our moral corruption, some account of basically the overall moral trajectory we human beings have to take, that's so integral to the goals of rational religion, that the doctrines that pertain to that are ones that you might think of as sort of most naturally understood as those that have that unity. But then there's other ones like the Trinity and the virgin birth and so on, that there's nothing about them that's necessarily offensive, right? It's not saying that there's this doctrine that's intrinsically incompatible with rational religion. It's just that, well, you know, there just may not be any use for it. Maybe there's a way of taking it as having use. And so Kant talks about vehicles, and so vehicles for rational religious principles. And so it might be that there are these doctrines that in some way or another are facilitators to what is sort of more at the core. Now, whether that's what exactly Kant meant by the distinction between unity or compatibility, I'm not sure, but you still can cash out his treatment of various doctrines in that framework.
That's very interesting. Moving on, in your book, you also discuss how Kant moves from the critique of practical reason, where he focuses on moral perfection, to another standard in religion, where he focuses on something that is called the change of heart. So why does he make this move? Why does he change the standard? And maybe can you explain just why in the critique of practical reason, moral perfection is kind of there, and then how we move towards the change of heart?
So one of the main theses of my book on the religion is to say that Kant's overall positive philosophy of religion is built upon the doctrine of the highest good. Basically, all is going to flow out of there. And so in the second critique, we have this anomalous characterization of the afterlife. So the highest good requires the postulates of God and immortality. And in the second critique, when Kant discusses the immortality of the soul, he assigns to it a role that we don't see in other texts. And that role is, well, we have to become worthy, we have to become morally worthy of happiness. That's sort of the integral to the doctrine of the highest good. How does that happen? When does that happen? So Kant suggests in the second critique that in the eternal existence that we have after this life, there will be this kind of asymptotic movement towards moral perfection. And God then passes this judgment upon us as, you know, having put in as much effort as we're capable, and rewards us with happiness.
Yeah.
And so there's an issue there of mercy, right? That I think that Kant might have been uncomfortable with, because Kant often says, you know, God, we have to understand God in terms of a being of justice, right? So the idea of God as a distributor of happiness in proportion to moral worth is this model of God as a judge, right, and a distributor based upon that judgment. But then if we have this idea that, okay, well, there's this asymptotic approach towards moral worthiness, we never really get there, and then God mercifully gives it to us anyhow, then that sort of runs in tension with the idea of God as simply as judge, right?
Yeah.
And Kant in the religion and elsewhere doesn't want that tension. So I kind of suspect that was sort of something Kant was thinking about, in the latter part of the 1780s. I think there's certain other philosophical reasons or theological reasons for Kant doing it, but it's the outlier. Where elsewhere, the afterlife is understood as that domain in which there is that distribution of happiness in accordance with moral worth. So in the second critique, it's, well, the afterlife is where we become morally worthy, but not quite. God sort of takes it, our efforts as adequate and gives us mercy and then distributes happiness. So the afterlife in the second critique is we do what we can, God gives us mercy and thus distributes happiness with that mercy in mind. But elsewhere, it's we become worthy and God distributes happiness. There isn't that idea of that mercy piece filling in that gap for our shortcomings. So if moral perfection was what was required for our happiness, how do we ever become morally perfect? Even in the afterlife, Kant says we can't. But what we have in the religion is a different standard. The standard that Kant uses in the religion for a moral worthiness is not perfection, but rather whether or not we have a good disposition. So moral perfection could be understood in terms of my gaining all the virtues, right? Being as just and as courageous and as self-controlled, having all the virtues, right? Achieving perfect virtue. Kant explicitly in the religion downplays virtue, thinks that, a morality of virtue has these pitfalls, and he mentions various pitfalls. And he proposes instead as the moral standard whether or not one has a good or an evil casino. And that means basically whether or not somebody has as their supreme maxim, a maxim that prioritizes morality over self-interest, or a maxim that prioritizes self-interest over morality. So the change of heart, which is a pietist phrase that Kant adopts, the change of heart basically refers to the shift from having a supreme maxim that prioritizes self-interest over morality to a supreme maxim that prioritizes morality over self-interest. Somebody who undergoes a change of heart is somebody who has adopted the latter, somebody who's gained a good casino. And thus, that then becomes the standard for whether or not one is worthy of happiness.
I see. Maybe some follow-up questions or some clarifications for me. When you might heard the phrase "the change of heart," it actually sounds kind of, and this refers back to a discussion we had earlier, related to kind of what is the motivational piece. That almost seems to be that it's kind of the emotions, like something, the change of heart. Kind of that's what it seems to imply, but that's probably not what it is. But maybe just to clarify, like how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I'm not sure whether or not we can sort of take out of Kant's uses the term heart any kind of technical meaning. So, if I were to say, what's in your heart or what lays at the center of your heart, these are metaphors, right? Because what lays in my heart? Blood, right? So these are metaphors. And so the change of heart is, it's a common phrase we use in English as well, right? I've had a change of heart about it. There's some deep change, right? And so I just tend to read it as that, right? That there's no technical meaning to it. It's a well-known phrase for Kant's time, just as it is now. It was a popular phrase within the pietist community, and it captured. So once again, if we think about the project of the religion as taking all these doctrines of historical faith and finding out whether or not they have unity or compatibility with rational religion, well, there's this doctrine called the change of heart, right? And so the change of heart within pietist circles is somebody who has transitioned from basically someone who is not sanctified to somebody who is sanctified, somebody who's undergone this sort of change such that they're now well pleasing to God.
I see.
So I take it that Kant is again taking this element of historical faith and is giving it an interpretation that locates it, gives it a location within rational religion.
And another question to clarify. So this change of heart, is it still kind of in a timely matter, in some sense that there is, I mean, moment X, or is it kind of what should we read into it?
Well, here's one way to think about it. Kant presumes that we all start out with a disposition that prioritizes self-interest over morality. Kant presumes that that's where we all start out. You know, another thing to bear in mind is if Kant thinks that it's not until a child reaches the age of 8 or 9 or 10 that they start engaging in moral decision making, then do we want to say a child of 6, right, has an evil disposition? So, right, there's a question there about time, right? Yeah. Does the child of 6 have an evil disposition if they're not yet fully a rational agent? So by the time they are a rational agent, they have an evil disposition. At the age of 6, arguably they don't. At the age of 10, presumably they do, right? So I think it's really hard to get away from some temporal aspects to this.
I see. Yeah.
And then when you think about the change of heart, well, the general remark at the end of part 1, and then the bulk of part 2, and it's in its own way, parts 3 and 4, all deal with the change of heart, all deal with getting to that stage where you are well-pleasing to God. So if at the age of 6 you have, you know, you haven't yet adopted an evil disposition, it's innate in some sense that it's sort of in potency or something like that. But you can't really say this is an evil child if they're not engaging in moral reasoning. At the age of 10, let's say this child is now morally evil. There's the possibility at some point, by the age of 18 or 22 or 43 or 65 or whatever it is, that something's happened in that person's life such that they no longer prioritize self-interest over morality, but now they prioritize morality over self-interest. So I would take it that the change of heart is something that is in time. That doesn't mean you can pin down exactly when it happens, but Kant calls it a spontaneous revolution, right? So whereas, you know, our virtues are something that we sort of develop slowly, progressively, Kant characterizes the change of heart as spontaneous. So, you know, you can think about it sort of within the standard kind of conversion stories of somebody suddenly kind of hit with, you know, an experience that changes them forever. But again, the texts are kind of underdetermining on this point, but I just think that the natural read of it is to think that the change of heart is something that is in time. You may not be able to pin down when it happened, but if somebody at the age of 65 has a good disposition and at the age of 43 doesn't, then somewhere between them, something's happened.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. And one kind of complaint, or at least worry, that has been raised with kind of Kant's general views with regards to like the philosophy of religion is that Kant potentially reduces religion to morality. So maybe putting this question to you, does Kant reduce religion to morality?
Well, one issue there is, what's the whole point of all matters of religion, right? What's the purpose of it? Like if we go back to what we were talking about earlier with regards to our hindrances to moral resolve, and that the adoption of a religious worldview and the doctrine of the highest good and the postulates are in the service of addressing that hindrance, then, you know, somebody might say, well, the whole point of religion then has to do with our moral efforts. That doesn't necessarily mean that religion as such is reduced to morality. But then here's the other thing. If the whole project of the religion is to appraise these doctrines, to assess whether or not they fall within the sphere of rational religion, and if rational religion is understood as those doctrines that are in the service of morality, then, you know, we can say that morality serves as a kind of arbiter. It serves as the warrants for religion, and it serves as the arbiter for religious doctrines. Those two things suggest a kind of reduction. But I don't think that's the end of the story, because say, for instance, issues of miracles, right? Kant would want us to be agnostic. as to whether or not any particular miracle claim is true. You're not in an epistemic situation to be able to assess whether or not a miracle claim is true or not. So for the most part, any miracle, at least that's compatible with a moral God, is any miracle claim is of that sort is at least a possible miracle. And so on the one hand, he calls for agnosticism on epistemic grounds, but he doesn't deny, he doesn't want to simply dismiss all of these things.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not as if he reduces religion to morality in the sense that he's going to reject everything,
mm-hmm.
right? That doesn't directly have that unity. It's sort of like the issue between unity and compatibility, right?
Mm-hmm.
That there's a domain of religion that is compatible with morality, but may not be something that morality requires. But then you could go farther and you could say something like this. You could say that if what I need to do in order to address my moral hindrances is to adopt the doctrine of the highest good and adopt the postulates, well, what about participating within organized religion? What about engaging in rituals? What about attending a house of worship? What about the practice of religion? Kant, in part 4, talks about prayer and church going and rituals and provides a way of understanding them as carrying a moral value. That is, how doing these things can facilitate your efforts as a moral agent. Mm-hmm. So while it might be that religious activity is justified for us for the sake of morality, it's not as if the only thing that we have that's in religion that Kant would allow for are the practical postulates, mm-hmm. right? He, treats a whole range of religious doctrines and treats religious practices and seems to endorse many, as at least contingent vehicles, things that we, one way or another, we need to find something to kind of serve a role for us. It may be 1,000 different types of prayer. It might be church going, synagogue going, mosque going, right? But what particular empirical form it takes, Kant is pluralistic.
Mm-hmm. I see it.
But doing these things or adopting these attitudes seem to play a role for Kant with regards to morality. Is there any other relevance to religion other than morality? Well, we can say we're open to the possibility that there are these miracles. We're open to the possibility of this array of religious worldviews and stories. Mm-hmm. But whether or not we should adopt them, I think that question is a question that's evaluative. That evaluative question is one that's guided by morality.
Mm-hmm. I see it.
By moral needs.
Very interesting. And maybe one final broad question. What would you say is the relevance of kind of Kant's views and his philosophy of religion, just more broadly speaking, within kind of the broader context of the philosophy of religion? And then also maybe within, not necessarily philosophy of religion, but kind of maybe what should kind of religious thinkers kind of, or people that are thinking about religious questions, kind of what can they learn from Kant's philosophy of religion?
Well, I think one thing is that Kant has a really worthwhile way of understanding religious pluralism.
I see.
So that, some religious pluralists would want to say, look, there are no truth claims or something like that. It's all just symbolism, right? Or it's all just a matter of feelings or expression or something like that. Or somebody might want to say that sort of there's a metaphysical truth, and sort of there's different ways of trying to capture that metaphysical truth given our epistemic limitations. But I see part of what I see Kant is doing is trying to provide an account of what the overall value of religion is, and providing that account in such a way that is open to, in theory, any particular religious tradition. So, you can engage in the project of the religion, trying to figure out whether or not there's unity or compatibility between historical doctrines and rational religion by looking at Muslim or Hindu and so forth. And so there is a pluralism, but there's also a normative or evaluative model to look at different religions and assess them. So the individual expressions are, Kant sometimes talks about them as arbitrary and contingent, right? And one of the important points there is therefore that Kant really wants to avoid dogmatic thinking. Kant doesn't want somebody to say, here's this doctrine that is the religious truth. Rather, there is a kind of moral need. There's a set of things that morality requires of us with regards to our facing challenges in life that morality may facilitate. That religion may facilitate, and that's different religions that may facilitate it in their own respective ways. So rather than say, here's the true doctrine, these are the false doctrines, it's rather whether or not these doctrines function in the service of morality or not. And if they don't function in the service of morality, it doesn't mean they're wrong, doesn't mean they're false. They just may be kind of neutral. So the avoidance of dogmatic thinking is something that I think is particularly helpful when we think about religion from a Kantian standpoint. And then also a way of understanding pluralism, right? That's not overly wishy-washy, right? It gives us, I think, a good philosophical way of thinking about religious pluralism. And, those two things, right? Understanding different points of view, respecting different points of view, getting beyond, right, the reductive dogmatic thinking, all those lessons of the religion have, important, right, application still today.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much. So, Professor Pasternack, this has been very interesting, and I learned a lot. So, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Do you have any parting words to the audience?
Kant's Religion is an interesting text. It's a controversial text. If you want to explore it, my book was mentioned. There's other interpretations out there. And so maybe one thing is that if you want to explore it, bear in mind there's different interpretations, and judge for yourself which one you think is right.